Call to order the regular meeting of the James City County Planning Commission for July 3rd. Mr. Holt, will you call the roll?
Ms. Leverins.
Here.
Ms. Leverins is an at-large member. Mr. Polster.
Here.
Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District. Mr. Haldeman.
Here.
Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District. Mr. Schmidt.
Here.
Mr. Schmidt represents the Roberts District and is this year's vice chair. Mr. O'Connor.
Present.
Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member. Mr. Kropf.
Here.
Mr. Kropf represents the Powhatan District. Mr. Richardson.
Here.
Mr. Richardson represents the Stonehouse District and is this year's chair. I'm Paul Holt, Director of Community Development and Planning for the county, and sitting to my left is Mr. Max Halavin, our Assistant County Attorney. Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. We come to the time for public comment, and seeing and hearing no one, we will close the public comment, and we will move to reports of the Commission. For the Development Review Committee, Mr. Kropf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Development Review Committee met at 4 p.m. on June 20th, 2018. Mr. Haldeman, Mr. Polster, Mr. Schmidt, and I were present to review two conceptual plans. C-0038-2018 Chickahominy Riverfront Park Improvements. James City County Parks and Recreation submitted a proposal to build an additional boathouse on site and to relocate an existing RV boat storage area. Also proposed are other improvements such as a public launch area for paddlecraft and public rental operations. A 2009 SUP condition requires that any changes or improvements to the site be reviewed by the DRC for a determination of consistency with the Chickahominy Riverfront Master Plan and the Shaping Our Shores report. The additional boathouse and RV storage area are not shown on the current master plan. However, the storage facility was in place at the time the county acquired the property. The additional boathouse is requested because the existing boathouse is under an exclusive lease agreement with the College of William and Mary, and the second one is needed for the Williamsburg Boat Club and the community as a whole. The RV boat storage area is next to the existing boathouse, but would be relocated to a larger area to provide additional revenue and better customer services. Staff also recommended that the applicant be required to develop a spill prevention plan to address potential oil and fuel leaks at the facility. The DRC voted 4-0 that the improvements were generally consistent with the approved master plan and the Shaping Our Shores report, and this item is on tonight's consent agenda. C-0025-2018 Forest Heights Neighbors Drive rezoning amendment. The applicant, Mr. Douglas Harbin, submitted a conceptual plan proposing to amend the 2011 rezoning application for Forest Heights, Neighbors Drive, and Richmond Road improvements. The original master plan showed approximately 27 acres for single-family detached residences. The remaining 20 acres, which is north of Forest Heights Road, was proposed for the location of a new Salvation Army facility with offices, a community meeting space, accessory uses, and future residential uses. The applicant stated that the Salvation Army is no longer interested in the site and so has proposed adding 46 multifamily units and commercial or institutional uses within an approximate 12-acre area. The 46 multifamily units represent a reduction of 16 units from the 62 units originally proposed for the Salvation Army site. The applicant also indicated the possibility of an assisted living facility to replace the Salvation Army uses shown on the original master plan. All proposed units will be designated workforce housing, and one current and one former resident of the subdivision attended the meeting to ask questions and express support for the proposal. No action was required by the DRC on this case, which will come before the Planning Commission for a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors. That concludes my report, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kropf. Are there any questions? Thank you. Now on to the Policy Committee report. Mr. Haldeman.
Hi. The Policy Committee met on June 14th. The meeting came to order at 4 p.m. with Mr. Richardson, Kropf, Schmidt, and I in attendance. In response to a request by the Board of Supervisors, the committee initiated a review of a legislative application deferral policy for the Planning Commission. Mr. Paul Holt, Director of Community Development, introduced a draft prepared by the planning staff that relied upon language in the supervisor's deferral policy. The draft essentially limits the period during which an applicant may request a deferral to 100 days, which is consistent with Virginia statute, in total from the time that the application is deemed complete, if it has not yet been advertised, or from the date of the first advertisement if it has been advertised. The Director of Planning may grant a deferral prior to advertising after considering 6 specific factors, and the Planning Commission may grant a deferral after the application is advertised and after opening a public hearing. The applicant may withdraw the application at any time. The committee made a few minor changes to the draft and then voted unanimously to recommend the policy to the Planning Commission. The meeting adjourned at 4:41 p.m.
Thank you, Mr. Alderman. Yes, ma'am.
I was present at the meeting, too.
Beg your pardon.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Thank you, Mr. Alderman. We will move on now to our consent agenda. Consent agenda items are determined to be non-controversial. However, a planning commissioner can pull any item for discussion. There are 3 items this evening for consideration. The minutes from the May 22nd joint work session, the minutes from the June 6th regular meeting, and the DRC action item case number C-0038-2018, Chickahominy Riverfront Park improvements.
Motion to approve the consent agenda?
Motion on the floor. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, Mr. Kropp. We will move on now to the public hearings and case ZO-0002-2018 and SO-0002-2018 zoning and subdivision ordinance amendments for bicycle and pedestrian accommodations. Mr. Baruch and Ms. Suloff.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the Planning Commission. At the May 23, 2017 Board of Supervisors and Planning Commission joint work session, the Commission and the Board asked staff to research the ability to add transportation and bicycle and pedestrian accommodations as binding master plan elements, along with reviewing and revising the zoning ordinance if necessary. Currently, transportation impacts created by developments requiring legislative approval are addressed by 3 administrative policies and corresponding submittal requirements. These policies include, first, the Pedestrian Accommodations Master Plan, which was implemented as a binding resource in determining pedestrian accommodation requirements external to a development, unless otherwise required by the Pedestrian Accommodations section of the zoning ordinance. Second, the Regional Bikeways Master Plan encourages the coordinated development of a comprehensive system of bikeways throughout the region. And third, the Traffic Impact Analysis Submittal Requirement Policy, also known as the TIA, was designed to provide guidance to the applicants regarding the minimum content required for a TIA. The TIA and its recommendations often form the basis for transportation-related proffers and SUP conditions. Some examples of types of infrastructure these policies have guaranteed include multi-use paths, bicycle lanes, traffic lights, turn lanes, etc. The ability to get these improvements, especially if located off-site, is extremely limited without the use of proffers. Upon review of the enabling legislation and state code and the ordinances of peer localities, staff suggests the Planning Commission consider including language in Section 2435 pedestrian accommodations to extend the requirements of this section to bicycle facilities per the adopted Regional Bikeways Master Plan. Unlike bicycle and pedestrian accommodations, most transportation improvements commonly identified through the TIA cannot be addressed through the master plan requirements, submittal requirements, or other administrative processes, as many of those improvements are considered off-site. In light of this, staff recommends the addition of ordinance language which more explicitly addresses VDOT's role in the site plan and subdivision approval process and states that the county cannot approve a site plan or subdivision plan unless VDOT has given their approval. Lastly, staff also recommends the addition of language to the TIA policy to provide guidance in its use in a post-proffer framework. To this point in time, the policy has been used as a tool to assess proffers and SUP conditions. Staff is recommending the addition of an adequate facilities test similar to the adequate public schools facilities test to provide clarity on how the policy should be used in cases without SUP or proffer options. This test would be applied to any case requiring a TIA per the submittal requirements. If the TIA recommends any off-site improvements or identifies any off-site impacts, and the applicant can mitigate those impacts through the master plan or other processes, then that plan would pass the test. If any off-site impacts are not mitigated, the plan would fail the test. In much the same spirit as the schools test, the additional language would not be an absolute divining rod, but a measure to take into consideration in the evaluation and recommendation process. The policy currently outlines the steps for identifying impacts, but does not give staff, the PC, or the board any direction for instances when those impacts cannot be addressed. At its May 10th meeting, the Policy Committee voted 5-0 to recommend approval of the draft ordinances and policy language. Staff recommends the Planning Commission recommend approval of the ordinances and policy language to the Board of Supervisors. We would be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions or comments, edits? Very much.
Mr. Richardson?
Yes, please.
While we're updating this ordinance, could we also modernize some of the language? There are 8 separate instances in 24-35 that reference the planning director or his designee. If we could just reference my email that I sent on the 29th of June, change those to planning director or designee. Thank you.
Staff will certainly work on that prior to the board meeting.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Silvers. Thank you. Anyone else? Thanks very much. And we will open the public hearing. Open any comment. Seeing and hearing no one, we will close the public hearing and look to my colleagues for discussion or a motion. Now, just a nuance, we are able to make a motion for both of these simultaneously, or if you would prefer, we can break them apart. It's entirely up to you.
And Mr. Chairman, as well, while the commission is deliberating and or making recommendations for a motion, there's a third piece to that, and that's a proposed set of amendments to the TIA policy to create the adequate transportation test. Actually be 3 components that staff would look for.
Okay.
For a recommendation to send on to the board.
Okay.
I recommend we approve for forwarding to the Board of Supervisors all 3 of these ordinances and policies as amended.
Thank you.
So for clarity, the motion on the floor is to recommend approval to the board of ZO-0002-2018 and SO-0002-2018, which are subdivision and subdivision ordinance amendments for bicycle and pedestrian accommodations respectively, as amended, as well as recommending approval of the proposed additions to the traffic impact analysis policy. I'm sure that okay.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. You did. And a motion is on the floor. Mr. Holt, will you please call the roll?
Motion to recommend approval, Ms. Leverins?
Aye.
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor?
Aye.
Mr. Kropf?
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt?
Aye.
And Mr. Richardson?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Sir, thank you. We will move on to ZO-0001-2018 and SO-0001-2018. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the Planning Commission. James City County is endowed with many natural resources, including rare, threatened, and endangered species and rare natural communities. The county is also one of the oldest settlements in the country and has numerous documented and unknown archaeological sites. In order to better preserve and protect the county's natural and cultural assets, the Board of Supervisors adopted the Archaeological Policy and the Natural Resources Policy in 1999 and 1998. The Natural Resource Policy seeks to identify and conserve areas with significant natural resource potential. The Archaeological Policy seeks to identify and protect areas with significant archaeological potential. If it is determined that a significant natural or cultural resource exists, both policies require that conditions or proffers requiring compliance with these policies are included for all appropriate rezoning and special use permit applications. The Natural Resource Policy requires that a natural resource inventory for a subject area be submitted for review and approval prior to land disturbing. Staff reviews the inventory in conjunction with the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Division of Natural Heritage. If the inventory confirms that a natural heritage resource exists or could be supported, a conservation management plan and/or mitigation plan is submitted for county approval. The Archaeological Policy requires a Phase 1 archaeological study be submitted for review and approval prior to land disturbing. Once submitted, staff reviews the study in conjunction with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, which determines if the study meets its standards and has been conducted under the supervision of a qualified archaeologist. If further archaeological study is required, the policy provides standards for the study and for treatment or the mitigation plans. These policies have helped staff to better evaluate applications and make recommendations on legislative cases. However, recent updates to the Virginia Code through Virginia Senate Bill 549 limits the ability of local governments to accept proffers for residential rezoning proffer amendments. Absent proffers, these policies have limited ability to address the impact of residential development in areas where natural or archaeological resources exist. Staff has worked in conjunction with the policy committee to identify ways to incorporate the intent of both policies into the zoning ordinance. The policy committee reviewed the revisions to the natural resource and archaeological language at its meetings in September of 2017, February, and April of 2018. The committee reviewed different approaches, but concur with the one that adds the requirement to complete and submit an environmental inventory and or a phase 1 study as a submittal requirement for a site plan and major subdivisions with an exemption criteria. At the Joint Planning Commission and Board Supervisors Work session on February 27, 2018, the board selected the same option. Following review of updated language at the Joint Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors Work session on May 22, 2018, the board provided comments and additional guidance to move the draft ordinances forward to the Planning Commission. Staff has drafted new ordinance language, which is included in your package as attachment number 1 through 5. Staff recommends the Planning Commission recommend approval of the attached subdivision and zoning ordinance revisions to the Board of Supervisors. At this time, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rubio. Anyone comments or questions for staff? Thank you so much. And we will open the public hearing for these, and it's comprehensive. If I misspoke before, it is also including ZO-003 and SO-0003. So the subdivision ordinance amendments for the natural resource policy and the zoning and subdivision ordinance amendments for archaeology. Is there any public comment? Seeing and hearing no one, we will close the public comment and look to my colleagues for discussion. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Richardson, I have a question because I notice in most of the ordinances, the word shall is used in preference to the word should. I found 3 instances in section 24 where the word should appears. So that my question is whether this, in fact, is a voluntary item or whether we should substitute the word shall. So, for example, on page 3 of section 24-23 in the footnote, second paragraph of the footnote says a total of 12 copies of the master plan should be submitted.
That one is intentionally optional because
Okay.
depending on the agencies involved and where we are in the process, we could adjust that.
Great, thank you. On the next page, maybe the same things. Item B, supplemental information should be submitted in accordance with supplemental information.
I believe that one says should as well because it's a policy.
Okay, good.
So
And then
technically that one
section
could be.
24-50, item 1B2, the phase 3 study should identify in accordance with accepted practices. On page 2 of section 24-50, about halfway
got
down
it,
the page, item little.
Second, I'm
Yeah, the phase 3 study
Little two.
should identify in accordance with accepted practices, all sites, et cetera.
One second here.
referring to Section 2450, standards for
Right,
archaeological studies.
on page 2.
On page 2, where it says, sub-item 2, the Phase 3 study should identify in
Right.
accordance with accepted practice of.
My question is whether that word should be shall.
Ms. Leverance, members of the committee, it should be shall, that particular instance. I went back to the original archaeological policy, and I do not recall there being any discussion, deliberate conversation at the policy committee to change that wording. So again, the full effort of the particular ordinance amendment that is before you is to the greatest degree practicable, translate the existing policies into ordinance. So, like I say, without a recollection that the policy committee specifically recommended that change, I think our recommendation is that word should be shall, because that is consistent with the policy that the board currently has, and we can make that change prior to getting to the board.
And then section 19-27, a couple of proofreading catches. Page 3, section Q3. The preliminary plan is for A, property boundary line adjustments and or extinguishments, so it should either be plural or
Sorry,
singular.
Ms. LaVergne, could you reference the number again?
It's page 3 of section 19-21,
Okay.
and item Q3. It says, the preliminary plan is for A, property boundary line adjustments and or extinguishments, so I recommend we just delete the word A there.
Okay.
And the same thing on the next page, item R3, just delete the word A.
Yes, ma'am.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Any comments or edits? And this will be similar to the last case. I believe we can combine the ordinances, and the motions could address those two in particular. I would think that two separate motions, though, would be necessary, considering ZO002, SO002, and then ZO001, SO001.
It be at the pleasure of the commission, where you're happy to,
Holistically.
yeah, holistically, or they are two discrete topics, so you could do one specific to archaeology and one specific to natural resources.
I'll defer to my colleagues.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we recommend to the Board of Supervisors ZO 0001-2018, pardon me, and SO 0001-2018 zoning and subdivision ordinance amendments for the natural resources policy, and ZO 0003-2018 and SO 0003-2018 zoning and subdivision ordinance amendments for the archaeological policy.
Thank you, Mr. Haldeman. There's a motion on the floor. Mr. Holt, would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Leverance?
Aye.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, Mr. Haldeman, those were motions to recommend approval as amended, as discussed?
As amended, yes, thank
in
you.
the meeting. Okay. Ms. Leverance?
Aye.
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor?
Aye.
Mr. Krupp?
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt?
Aye.
And Mr. Richardson.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you. We will move on now to the Planning Commission considerations. With specificity, the legislative application deferral policy. And Mr. Holt.
So well, and making the motions and the titles with all those ZO and SO, all those zeros. The year we hit into the thousands, I'm going to do an early retirement. No such numbering system for this specific item, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. In fact, Mr. Haldeman did such an excellent job earlier in his report out for the policy committee. Serves as a really good detailed stand-in for the staff report. But, nonetheless, again, just real briefly, during the Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors joint work session on May 22nd, Mr. William Porter, who's the interim county administrator, addressed the commission and board on the topic of legislative applications. Following that conversation, the Board of Supervisors asked the commission to consider developing a legislative application deferral policy. As was mentioned earlier, the basic framework of the policy that's before you was an attempt to both follow the framework that's laid out in the currently adopted legislative application deferral policy that the Board of Supervisors has, and also be mindful of the state code requirements, which limits Planning Commission review to 100 days. On June 14th, Policy Committee voted unanimously in support of the attached policy, and I would be answering questions that you have.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. Questions or comments?
I think it's important to note that the 100-day requirement that's imposed upon us regardless of whether the applicant asks for the deferral or not, if I'm understand it correctly. So, you know, it's really just to codify our process to match state code versus just doing something arbitrary. So.
Sir. And if I may, Mr. Holt, any action on our part in terms of a vote, or do we simply allow this now to pass on to the board?
No, so it's a bit unique. This will, the way it's been formatted and proposed, this would be a Planning Commission policy. So upon a motion and a roll call vote this evening, if it's approved, this policy would be effective.
Okay, thank you. And with that, if I could entertain a motion.
Approve the deferral policy for the plan.
Thank you. So moved. And Mr. Holt, would you please call the roll?
Yes, sir. Ms. Leverance.
Aye.
Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor.
Aye.
Mr. Crop.
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt.
Aye.
And Mr. Richardson.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. And on back to you, sir, for the Planning Director's report, please.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Members of the Commission, other than what's been provided in your agenda packets, I don't have anything new or additional to add this evening, but I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions.
I was happy to see the addition of the the website address for the Pocahontas Trail that was in your report. I was a little disappointed because I was hoping to see a further timeline besides what is there, which essentially ends in May. But I really did like the idea that with that Pocahontas Trail page, it gives you the option to sign up for any updates through the email system so that you can, in fact, see what events were there. So I was hoping that we'd see an updated timeline and that way maybe notify some of the other members that were on that committee as to what are the follow-on things we can expect.
Sure. I think we're happy to do that. The good news is that when and if the project ever receives funding, again, it's very typical for VDOT to set up project pages and to transition from sort of the study piece into the next phase piece. Again, I think we talked a little bit about next month. Don't have any definitive dates to fill in at this point. It's very exciting as staff because, again, with the presumed adoption of the study by the board, staff will quickly go out and apply for as many different funding sources as we can identify, and hope that quantity and quality in terms of applying for state funding will work to our advantage. So that's going to be, again, with the presumption that the board adopts the study, that will be our goal for the summer, and we hope to have, depending on how that goes, we hope to have some new updates to be able to add to the webpage later this summer.
Thank you.
Fingers crossed, yes.
Thank you. Anyone else? And we will move on to Planning Commission discussion and requests. Anyone has a point for discussion or request or comment? Thank you very much. Then I would like to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned.
Gas, since motorists have more opportunities to turn left and reduce time sitting at the intersection, and increase safety. In fact, according to national data, these signals can reduce left